He paid the highest price at the auction, then tore up the bill of sale before anyone could hand it to him. It was the winter of 1879 in Copper Bend, a wind-bitten town tucked against the high plains. Smoke from wood stoves clung to the cold air, and justice came slower than the stagecoach. Behind the freight office, where dirt had turned to dust and boots had worn down the boards, a woman stood on the auction platform in torn deerskin, her wrists bound and her spine unbroken. She wasn't bought that day. She was offered a door and chose to walk through it. Today, we'll walk through their journey from a cold auction block to the choices that forced an entire town to face itself. A story not loud but deep, like the scar every soul carries. If stories like this speak to you, take a second to follow the channel and leave a like. It helps me keep these forgotten Western stories alive one day at a time. Some women get broken, some get quiet, and some they just square their shoulders and wait for the moment that changes everything. Copper Bend didn't wake kindly that morning. The frost clung stubborn on porch rails, and the wind carried the kind of silence that comes before judgment. Behind the freight office, where boots had beat the dust into stone and boards, showed the nails that winter pulled loose. Men gathered like wolves too lazy to hunt, waiting for the next thing to be offered. And on the platform, they placed her. Her name hadn't been spoken. Just Apache girl. Just lot number 3. The crowd didn't need her name, not yet, and she didn't offer it. Her wrists were still red from the rope, her dress torn at the shoulder and hip. But her chin never dropped. Not once. They wanted her to flinch. They wanted her to fold. Instead, she met them, all of them, with that quiet, sharp stillness that only comes from someone who's had every right taken from them except their spine. Some of the men looked away. Some smirked. One tried a joke and the laughter came too easy. Laughter always does when no one's brave enough to stop what's happening. The sheriff stood at the edge of the platform, hat low, hand near his belt. Watching but not moving. Not yet. Then a man stepped forward, not from the crowd, but from the edge of it. Dust on his coat scar under one eye, a bullet-creased limp that made his walk uneven. Beckett Shaw. A rancher widowed by war and distance both. He hadn't come for this. He'd come for salt, for nails, and a tin of axle grease. But sometimes a man's business gets rewritten by what he sees. He watched her on that platform, watched the way she scanned the faces without begging, the way she refused to hunch her shoulders just to make it easier on the ones who came to look. He saw in her what he had once been, a person still standing after something had tried to shatter them. So when the bidding began, low, mean, full of chuckles, Beckett didn't joke. He raised a number that quieted the rail, and when the clerk rushed forward with the bill of sale, Beckett tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the dust. No claim, no contract. Just a voice that said, "You're coming with me." And that moment, that small, deliberate act, turned the auction yard on its side. Mini hook, but what makes a woman trust a stranger with no rope in his hand? And what makes a man carry a burden that isn't his? The road out of Copper Bend has a long way to go, and so do they. Let me pause for a moment and ask, where in the world are you watching from today? I love seeing the range of folks who still hold space for stories like these. And if this tale has kept you with us so far, consider hitting that follow button. It helps this small channel grow and gives me the fuel to keep telling stories that don't usually make it to history books. Your support truly means the world. Sometimes a man doesn't step forward because he's brave. He steps forward because he knows what it costs to look away. Beckett Shaw wasn't built for crowds. He moved through town the way wind moves through bare trees, quiet, efficient, gone as soon as the chore was done. That morning he came for supplies, nails, salt grease for the axle. Things a man needed to keep a winter from winning. He'd even folded the list just right in his coat pocket so it wouldn't tear. That was the kind of man he was. He hadn't planned to pass Copper Ben's auction yard. He hadn't planned to see her. But fate doesn't ask for permission. It just stands you still when something inside you refuses to keep walking. The platform creaked under her boots. Her dress was torn along the neckline and hip. Her wrists bore the red of rope burn. But her spine stayed straight like a banner that hadn't fallen. She did not lower her eyes. And in that refusal, she stole every man's excuse for pretending she wasn't human. Beckett had seen that look before. Not on a platform, but across fire-lit battlefields and in broken-down barns in the eyes of people who had lost everything except their right to decide how they would stand in the end. He watched her scan the crowd with practiced precision. Not fear, not panic, calculation. Pick the one face that might break pattern. Pick the one moment when the rope slips. That's all survival ever asks for one clean opening. And still he stayed still. Told himself it wasn't his place. But when a voice beside him barked out a price and the crowd chuckled like pigs at a trough, something old inside him shifted. A wound that had never closed fully, a brother buried far from home, a promise made to no one but the silence. The next number out of Beckett's mouth wasn't smart. It wasn't safe. But it was final. The auctioneer stammered, caught off beat. No one topped it. Not because they couldn't, but because they saw what was in Beckett's eyes. He wasn't there to win. He was there to end it. When the hammer fell, the clerk scrambled with a bill of sale. Fresh ink, blank name. Beckett took it, read it once, then tore it in two. Not for show, for truth. Some documents hold shame just by existing. He didn't touch her arm, didn't motion or speak loud, just said, "You're coming with me." Quiet. Flat. The kind of voice that lets a person choose. And she chose. On her own 2 feet. She passed through the crowd like wind through ash. A few men muttered. One reached out, and Beckett's stare shut him down before the sheriff had to move. The woman did not thank him. She did not owe him that. She kept her chin level and her pace even as if to remind everyone she was not taken. She walked out. They reached the horses without speaking. He passed her the reins to the spare mare, and a coat rolled tight. She took both, tested the stirrup mounted clean. The sound of hooves on hard dirt replaced the noise of the yard, and the silence between them was the kind that holds shape. The law had not freed her. The paper had not protected her. It had been a man with too many ghosts, and a woman with no room left to bow her head, walking out of town with the wind against their backs. But the road out of Copper Bend would not offer peace just yet. And neither of them knew how much of themselves they'd left behind on that cracked wooden platform, or how much still waited ahead. What do two people carry when they ride away from a crowd? One brings what he regrets. The other brings what she refuses to forget. They didn't speak for the first 2 miles. Beckett kept his gelding half a length ahead, letting the pace hold steady, letting her have space. The spare mare moved easy under her, and that told him something without words. She'd ridden before, not for pleasure, but for necessity, the way people do when the trail behind is worse than the trail ahead. The wind cut low across the flats. Their shadows rode beside them long and thin against the dirt, 2 shapes tied together by choice and silence. Kiona's wrists still stung beneath the wool sleeves. The salve he'd passed her sat in the coat pocket untouched for now. She didn't trust quiet gifts. Not yet. But she had taken it. That was step 1. Beckett kept his eyes moving the trail ahead, the creek line, the dry rise beyond. He wasn't expecting trouble, but trouble didn't wait for expectation. He'd seen too much of that in the war, and too much after. He counted the sounds, their own hoofbeats, the jingle of tack, the hush of wind in bare mesquite, and listened for what didn't belong. Then finally she spoke. "Do you have other hands at your place?" Simple, direct. He didn't turn to look at her, just answered the same way. "Not this winter. Sold 2 head to pay wages before the freeze. It's just me and a dog that thinks too much of himself." Kiona took that in. A house with 1 man and 1 dog meant fewer angles to watch. It also meant she'd hear every footstep that didn't belong. And where would I sleep? He nodded toward the trail ahead, like it pointed to the answer. Spare room, north wall, window sticks in cold, door latch turns from the inside. That last part from the inside landed soft and heavy, like something folded, not thrown. She didn't reply, but she marked it. They reached the halfway stone well by the time the sun hit its peak. He dismounted, first bucketed water for the horses, then for them. She slid down, careful, never turning her back on the trail or the man. He set a strip of jerky in her hand without asking. She chewed slow, keeping one eye on the skyline, one on him. The silence between them was beginning to change shape, not friendlier, not warmer, just more breathable. He uncapped a tin from his coat. "Winter hands," he said. "Salve. Works." He offered it. Open palm. She took it. For a moment, her fingers brushed his glove, and he didn't flinch or smile or try to make it mean anything. He just waited while she rubbed it into the red cuts on her wrists. She said, "I don't owe you for this." "No," he said. "You don't." That was the moment the distance between them stopped growing. It didn't close. Not yet. But it stopped widening. And sometimes that's enough. They mounted again. No words this time. Just the shared rhythm of moving forward. At the second rise, a rider showed up behind them, one of the ranch hands from the yard. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't out for a stroll either. Beckett felt his pulse shift. He reined closer to Kiona, kept his body between her and the stranger. "You paid high," the man said with a grin that wanted to be clever. "Could have waited and got cheaper." Beckett said nothing. The Henry rifle was in the saddle scabbard. His Colt was loaded but still holstered. His silence wasn't cowardice, it was measurement. If the man reached, he'd learn what Beckett had paid for wasn't charity. It was finality. The ranch hand spat and turned back toward town. Kiona didn't thank Beckett for stepping between. She didn't have to. He hadn't done it for thanks. They rode on the wind in their coats, the dust rising behind. That night they'd reached the ranch. A spare room with a latch from the inside. A pot of beans on the stove. A dog who barked first, then thought better of it. But right now the trail still held the weight of too many questions neither was ready to ask. And between them was a silence that had earned its place not as distance, not as danger, but as space. Because some stories don't start with love or trust or even kindness. Some stories begin with nothing but 2 people who stop running. Some doors close to keep people out. Others close because for the first time in a long time, no one has to run. The house came into view just as the light began to slant gold across the tops of the cottonwoods. It wasn't much. A low barn leaned slightly to one side like it had grown tired over the years but kept standing out of habit. The corral had a middle rail sagging where frost had split the grain. A well stood beside the porch with a bucket rope worn smooth. The porch itself showed boot scuffs, and the front door was plain wood, clean but unpainted. But it looked steady. And for Kiona, that was new. Beckett swung down first, checked the cinches, watered the horses. She stayed mounted a moment longer, scanning the yard, noting the lines of retreat, the distance from the creek, the vantage points where a man might stand and watch without being seen. Old habits, still needed. He didn't rush her. Just worked the well like he'd done it 100 times with no words and no signs of watching her too close. Only when she slid from the saddle did he speak. Water first, then heat. The dog, all ribs and bark, appeared from behind the shed. He gave 2 sharp warnings before recognizing the man, then dropped back into a slow, tail-wagging trot. Kiona stepped onto the porch. Her boots hit the boards like a test, and the wood held firm. She scanned the frame, the hinges, the latch. It turned from the inside. She reached out, touched the metal. It moved smooth. Inside the house was small, 1 room wide, 1 hallway long. The heat from the stove had lingered soft and steady. A tin pot hung over the coals, and the smell of beans and salt pork filled the air like a promise. She saw no bottles, no extra boots, no coat too small to belong to him. He pointed with his chin. Room across the hall, north wall. Window sticks in cold, but it lifts. Latch turns from inside. He said it again, not like he'd forgotten he already told her, but like he knew some things need to be repeated to feel real. She walked through the doorframe and stood in the spare room. The bed was narrow, the quilt sun-faded. A small trunk sat empty except for a folded wool blanket and a comb. She tested the latch. It moved. She tested the window. It stuck, then gave. She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped just a little, the kind of shift you only notice if you've carried too much for too long. Safety isn't a grand thing. It's quiet. It smells like beans on a stove and comes with a latch that turns from the inside. Back in the kitchen, he set a folded shirt on the chair. Clean, simple, cotton. A roll of cloth bandage lay beside it. "This'll fit," he said, "until you can fix what's torn." Then he turned his back and busied himself with the stove draft, not watching her undress, not offering false courtesy. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. The shirt covered what needed covering, and the bandage wrapped the wrist that still throbbed under the wool. They ate quietly. No prayer, no toast, no stories. Just the sound of spoons against tin of breath settling into the rhythm of shared space. He didn't ask about the auction. She didn't ask about the scar on his jaw. Some things they knew would come in time, or not at all. After supper, he rinsed the plates. She watched the way his hands moved. Clean, careful. Like someone used to doing for himself, but not too proud to share the work. The dog circled the doorway once, then lay down across it like a soft, breathing gate. Beckett said nothing about where she should sleep. He didn't hover, didn't offer to walk her to the room. He just nodded once toward the hall and said, "I'll leave the lamp on low. You can throw the latch when you're ready. Or not. Your say." And then he turned back to the stove, giving her the air to breathe. She stepped into the room and stood inside the doorway. Her palm touched the latch. She didn't throw it. Not tonight. But she could. And that, more than any warm meal or kind word, told her she might sleep without jerking awake at every sound. She left the door ajar. The dog huffed once and stretched out where he could see them both. No speeches. No promises. Just a latch that turned the right way, and a night that asked nothing more than rest. And sometimes, that's how healing begins. It wasn't the ring. It wasn't the name. It was the quiet and the fact that nobody reached for what hadn't been offered. When morning light stretched across the wooden floorboards, Kiona woke in a room she didn't recognize but didn't fear. No lock clicking. No heavy boots pacing the hallway. Just the house creaking with the cold, the stove ticking under its iron belly, and the dog breathing steady at the threshold, like a hinge between two people, not a wall. She sat up slowly, hand grazing the quilt that had kept her warm. Nothing in the room asked anything of her. It just waited. In the kitchen, Beckett had already set 2 tin cups. The smell of coffee reached her before his voice did. He sliced bread without looking up and nudged a plate toward the chair across from him. He didn't ask if she'd slept well. He didn't fill the silence with plans. He just poured the coffee, slid it her way, and let the morning be what it was. She sat. The warmth from the mug steadied her fingers. "If I wanted to leave this morning," she said. "Voice level, what would you do?" He looked at her. Not startled, not wounded, just honest. "I'd saddle your horse, walk you out to the stage road, and I wouldn't watch you ride off." She nodded once. It wasn't a test. It was a question she had to ask for herself. Some people say they'll let you go. Fewer mean it. Even fewer will ride beside you until you choose the turn. They ate in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because not all truths come with words. Some are shaped in the quiet between them. Afterward, Beckett reached into a drawer and pulled out a small tobacco tin. Inside were 2 torn halves of the sale paper, the ones he'd dropped in the dirt the day before. He laid them out beside a blank sheet. "If you want," he said, "you can write your name here. Not for me. For you." She looked at the torn paper, the ghost of a price tag that never should have been. Then she looked at the blank one. Clean. Empty. Waiting. She took the pencil. Wrote slowly, Kiona. No last name. No title. Just hers. He nodded. Folded the paper and slid it into the tin with the others. "The last name can wait," she said. "I don't need it to know where I am." Outside, a crow called once, then quieted. The light caught on the rim of the tin and stayed there soft and gold. Beckett didn't ask her to stay, and Kiona didn't say she would. But when she stood to clear her plate, she moved like someone who had decided for now this was where her feet belonged. The latch on her door still turned both ways. She touched it once. Didn't throw it. Didn't test it. Just let her hand rest on the wood. Some mornings don't need answers. Just the chance to choose without being chased. A man's word may hold in the hills, but in town it's paper and ink that keep mouths shut. They left at first light after a quiet breakfast and a single nod across the table that meant, "Let's go." Kiona wore the same deerskin dress, now stitched clean where the yard had torn it. She'd sewn the neckline higher, not to hide, but to reclaim. Beckett helped her mount without touching her wrist. She noticed that. Again. The road to Copper Bend was quieter than it had been days before. No dust trailing them. No voices rising from behind. Just 2 sets of hoofbeats and a wind that carried the sound of early spring water cracking through frost. They didn't talk about what the day would bring. They didn't have to. The weight of it was in the stillness between them. You don't ride into a town like Copper Bend to make a show. You ride in to make something hold. By the time the boardwalk came into view, the town was stretching into its routines, smoke rising from the cafe, a wagon unloading at the mercantile boots on the steps of the freight office, and a pair of eyes already watching. Sheriff Raines stood at the edge of the boardwalk, coat open, thumbs hooked in his belt, gaze cutting slow across the street, like a man who'd already done the math and was waiting for others to catch up. Kiona felt the nerves rise under her skin, like they used to when her camp crossed new borders. Beckett noticed and said just low enough, "You still walk." You still speak. Nothing changes that. She nodded. Once. They tied up near the courthouse. Beckett offered her the post closer to the steps, not because it mattered, but because it meant less ground between her and the door. That kind of quiet thinking stayed with her. Inside, the clerk looked up with the kind of tired disinterest that men wear when they've read too many names and not enough stories. He pushed the ledger forward, with ink still drying from the last line. License or filing, he asked, not yet caring who stood before him. License, Beckett said, then stepped back half a pace, so she could speak first. Kiona steadied her breath. Kiona, age 24. Residence 12 miles out by the stone well north edge marked in cottonwoods. Her voice didn't waver. Not once. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the name, glanced up, then saw Sheriff Raines leaning on the doorframe watching. His pen didn't stop moving after that. Beckett gave his own details. 41. Same residence. No prior claim or record. The clerk asked for witnesses. Beckett said the parson's wife would sign. Sheriff Raines, if needed. The man didn't laugh, but his mouth twitched like it wanted to. Then he saw how still Beckett stood, how level Kiona's eyes were, and whatever joke had almost surfaced drowned quietly. He sanded the page with a pinch from a shallow dish and pushed it forward. Kiona folded the slip herself, slid it into the breast pocket she'd sewn the night before. Not hidden. Not for anyone else to hold. Just there where it could live with her heartbeat. Outside again, the boardwalk looked narrower than before. A pair of ranch hands leaned near the cafe window. Same ones from the yard. Same hollow mouths. That's a high price to pay just to bring trouble home, one muttered. Kiona didn't flinch. Beckett didn't look. But Sheriff Raines took 2 steps between them and the voice and said flat as fence wood, the next man with a comment about price can make it at the judge's desk. No one moved. No one answered. Because gossip feels bold in shadows, but shrinks fast under daylight and paper. They crossed to the parson's small room. The door was already open. His wife stood ready with a pen that didn't blot, and a soft shawl that she draped over Kiona's shoulders without asking, just offering. The vows came quiet, clear, legal and plain. Do you take I do? Do you take I do? No poetry, no trembling, just choices laid down clean between 2 people who had earned the right to speak them. The ring went on without a shake. The paper got signed. Kiona's name first, her hand steady. Beckett's below slanted but certain. The parson's wife signed as witness. Then the sheriff. The book was shut. The copy handed to Kiona, not Beckett. She folded it and pressed it to her chest just under the stitched seam she'd reclaimed. Some folks think a name on paper is just a formality. But for a woman who's had hers stolen or silenced, it's everything. They left the parson's office without looking back. The men on the boardwalk didn't speak again. By the time they reached their horses, the only sound left was the creak of saddle leather and Pike's bark echoing from where the road curved home. And the question a listener might still carry, would the town let it stand, was answered in silence and ink where it could no longer be undone. Not every love begins with a kiss. Some begin with a shared hammer and a silence that doesn't need to be filled. The sun was high when they crossed the ridge and saw the ranch again, its lines still crooked, but its bones still holding. A cold wind swept across the dry field, and Pike barked from the edge of the clearing, his tail thumping once before settling back in the shade. They didn't say much on the ride home. The marriage certificate was folded into the inside pocket of Kiona's coat, nestled against her chest like a second heartbeat. She touched it once absent-mindedly, not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself it was real. Beckett dismounted first, held the reins of her horse, while she swung down without help. That small gesture you can, but I'm here if you need, was something she'd begun to notice more. The cabin looked the same, but stepping through the door felt different, like something had been unlocked from the inside. It wasn't the paper. It wasn't even the town. It was that they had walked through both side by side and returned still walking the same direction. That evening, she swept the front stoop without being asked. He stacked wood by the side wall with fewer glances over his shoulder than usual. They cooked together, quiet, efficient. Kiona kneaded the dough while Beckett sliced carrots and smoked venison. He let her correct the salt. She let him stir the pot. Somewhere between the boiling stew and the rhythm of two forks scraping two bowls, a new language was forming, one neither had spoken before. After dinner, Beckett stepped outside hammer in hand and began measuring the bent sections of the southern fence. Kiona followed, wrapping a shawl tight around her shoulders. She didn't offer words, just picked up a second post, set it straight, and held it firm while he nailed it in. "Too much to the left," she said at one point. He paused, squinted, and adjusted. "Better." She nodded. "Better." They worked side by side until the moon was a silver ghost behind the trees. When they finished, Beckett leaned on the last fence post, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "You ever imagine this?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "Your life turning into this?" Kiona rested her palms on the wood. "No," she said simply. "But I didn't imagine surviving either. So anything after that feels like a second story." He turned to look at her, but she wasn't looking back. She was watching the furrows in the dirt they'd plowed earlier that week, long imperfect lines etched into the earth, stubborn and hopeful. That's when he realized they hadn't just mended fences that day. They'd planted something too. When they returned inside, the cabin was warm. Beckett poured 2 cups of tea and left hers by the fire. Kiona sat cross-legged on the floor, turning the marriage certificate over in her hand like a stone worn smooth from worry. She didn't unfold it. She didn't need to. Beckett sat nearby, close enough to feel the fire between them, but not close enough to assume. Kiona reached forward and placed the folded paper on the low table between them. "I didn't do this for safety," she said after a while, "or to belong. I did it because you never once asked me to less than I am." Beckett nodded once like a man hearing something sacred. "And I never will." She leaned back against the wall, letting the fire warm her feet. Her eyes softened. "You'll have to teach me the rest of the land come spring," she said. "I only know half of it. Then spring'll be busy." Beckett replied, his voice softer than usual. "Plenty left to learn." The wind pressed against the shutters gently. The tea cooled in the cups. And for the first time, they didn't sit as a man and a woman trying to survive under the same roof, but as something different. Not lovers yet. Not quite family. But bound. By a fence rebuilt, a furrow shared, and a silence that no longer needed to be broken to be understood. Some wounds scar. Some grow roots. The snow melted without fanfare. One day it was there, white and wide, and the next, it simply wasn't. In its place, dark, wet soil, thirsty and waiting. Kiona moved through the thaw like someone relearning the language of earth. She dug with her hands, planting rows of beans, onions, and a few wildflowers she didn't name. Each seed was placed with care. Nothing rushed. nothing random. Beckett watched from the fence line. He didn't offer help. He'd learned not every strength needs company. Instead, he worked the rails, tightened what sagged, replaced what splintered. At noon, they shared bread in the shade. They didn't speak much, but the silence had changed. It didn't press down. It wrapped around them like cotton light, breathable. Inside the cabin bore new signs of her. A shelf with her stitching thread. A dress drying by the stove. The divider still stood in the corner, but she hadn't used it in weeks. Not out of duty, just choice. And when a woman stays by choice, the whole house knows. One morning, Kiona looked up from the garden and said, "These'll be ready by summer." Beckett nodded. "Good. We'll need the extra." She smiled, faint but real. "We," she repeated, like trying the word on her tongue. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn amber. Pike dozed at their feet. Beckett reached for her hand without looking. She didn't pull away. She hadn't left. And he no longer looked for anyone else to come. Not every love begins with a promise. Some just begin with staying. If this story of quiet beginnings, of slow trust and second chances touched something in you, maybe it reminded you of someone you're welcome here. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, what does home mean to you? We'll be back soon with another tale from the Old West, where silence heals and spring still comes, no matter what came before.